Good.
Ready? This is the Canadian Don Quixote, the biography of Major John Richardson, Canada's first novelist. And I wrote that because I felt that at the time Canada should have a literary tradition, and no one knew anything about this man. It took me 10 years to find out about him, and he turned out to be a wonderful writer, and probably our most colorful writer at that. And I'll just go through a little bit of his life. The picture on the front of the cover is of a duel in Hyde Park in 1815, and actually Richardson had fought a duel in Hyde Park in 1815 with a fellow officer who had disparaged the acting of Madame Vestry, a young actress at the time, very beautiful, and Richardson felt that merited a duel, particularly as a friend of his had made Vestry his mistress, and he felt it was a slur on his friend. That's a George Cruikshank drawing, by the way. There he is, a picture of him much later in his life when he was in Montreal. He was editor of a Montreal newspaper, 1848. And you see the medals here. Those medals are from Spain. He was a military man and was in the Carlist War in Spain. Here is where he began. Now, this is Queenston. Now, I had mentioned Robert Hamilton earlier. Here is his house. It was a sketch made by Lady Simcoe. It's in the center of the picture there. And that's where Richardson was supposed to have born. There's a plaque to that regard in Queenston. However, his aunt, Catherine Hamilton, St. Catherine's is named after her. You'll notice that it's spelled with Catharine with an A. That's the Indian spelling. She was half Indian. She was dying of tuberculosis the time Richardson was born, and died 2 months after. So I doubt very much if her younger sister had gave birth in her house. His father was a surgeon with the Queen's Rangers, and they were stationed in Fort George, and I imagine that's where Richardson was born. At any rate, he grew up in Amherstburg, where John Askin was, the great fur trader. And there's a picture of Amherstburg, and the town is on the right, and it's from Elliott's Point. And on the left is Bois Blanc Island, called Boblo nowadays. And that island, by the way, was for generations in the possession of the McKee family. McKee Rankin, about whom I wrote a biography, our greatest actor, he inherited that island, and used to have his actor friends from New York and up there in the summers. They had great parties. There is Tecumseh. Now, Richardson was a boy soldier in the War of 1812, and Tecumseh was very fond of him. And he wrote a great poem about Tecumseh. He was in the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh was killed, and he was taken prisoner and taken to Kentucky. And I put out a book called The Canadian Campaign, which is a reprint of his article, which was published in London in 1826-27. It's the narration of the battles and the experiences that he had at that time in the War of 1812. Very important for the commemoration of the war that's coming up these days. There's a picture of the Battle of the Thames, where Tecumseh was killed. The close battle, the close fighting. Actually, General Proctor was terrible. He sacrificed his troops so he could get away. There was they could have had a much more defensible position, but he left them in the woods there, and they didn't have much protection against the Kentucky riflemen, who fought like guerrillas behind trees and so forth in the Indian fashion. There is a picture of the Barbados where he was sent eventually. He'd gone to England to fight Napoleon. By the time he got there, Waterloo had taken place, and he was put on half pay. He thought his army career was over, but fortunately John Norton, or Niagara, was there, and Richardson got him to, with his prestige, to get him back in the army, and he was sent to Barbados and Grenada, which was a death trap because of all the yellow fever there. He caught yellow fever and almost died. He came back to Europe and he started writing. There's the Opera House in Paris. It's a scene in his novel, Écarté, his first novel, the first Canadian novel. It was published in 1829. It's a brilliant book. A master of romantic fiction, called at the time, and it's about gamblers. There's a scene of a gambling room. The young are dancing and the old are playing cards. Écarté, by the way, is the name of a card game. There's a picture of the Seine. Now the Englishmen, rich Englishmen, weren't allowed to gamble legally in London, so they all went to Paris. It was cheaper to live in Paris, and Richardson, on his half pay, lived there and traveled the continent a lot. They would lose all their money and drown themselves in the Seine. Richardson came back to London about 1827, and he was anxious to escape an unhappy marriage, and wanted to be taken on in active service again, so he volunteered for the Horse Guards and got to know many of the well-known generals of the period, and eventually was able to get a captain's commission in the British Auxiliary Legion, which was sent to Spain to fight in the Carlist War on behalf of the Queen Christina. That was quite an experience for him. Here's a picture of Wacusta. In the meantime, he'd written this novel, which was about the siege of Pontiac and Fort Detroit, and he made John Norton, or Chief Teonikawarren, the major figure, and he was given the name Wacusta, the war chief. And here is some pictures of San Sebastian in Spain, where he fought a great battle with the Carlists, what the British Legion did, and won, I think. And here is another scene of Victoria. They marched in a circular route, the whole army, overland through the mountains to Victoria inland to meet with the Spanish army. And they did that circuitous route to avoid fighting the Carlist guerrillas. Richardson was on that trek and wrote a journal about it, and I, in the modern day, traveled it by automobile and wrote a little essay, which I've included in the Canadian campaign. This compares 1835 to the present day, what I encountered. It'd be surprising how similar it was in some instances. Charles Richardson was Richardson's youngest brother. He was articled to John Beverley Robinson, and therefore became quite quite right-wing and quite conservative. And he was writing to his brother, come on back to Canada and start a newspaper, a Tory newspaper, so we can battle back the reformers, particularly William Lyon Mackenzie. And this young man, when he was 21, with others, dumped Mackenzie's press into the Lake Ontario, which made Mackenzie rather famous, and promoted his press unwittingly. Lord Durham came out after the rebellion to try to establish peace, and he initiated reforms. Well, John Richardson did come back to Canada as a correspondent for the London Times. Now, the London Times was a Tory newspaper, and they were not in favor of Durham. But Richardson became enamored of Durham and developed and wrote about his policies and great favoritism. So he was fired from the Times and had to make his way. And he made his way through journalism. But these men were his opponents. The man on the left there, Hinks, became the Prime Minister of Canada later on. But he was a reformer, a radical reformer, and was a great enemy of Richardson and the newspaper press. And this fellow, this Derbyshire, Stuart Derbyshire, had been a friend of Richardson. He'd known him in Spain. They were journalists together in London. But he sort of threw his lot in with the reformers. And because the reformers were really in power then, he got the appointment to Queen's Printer, which Richardson so much badly wanted. And so Richardson finally ended up as superintendent of police on the Welland Canal with a small force trying to control the canalers who were provoked. The Protestant Irish were fighting the Catholic Irish, and there were riots. And at first the workers were fairly well paid because it was under the government. Then the government sort of contracted things out to American contractors who paid starvation wages. And this caused the rioting and Richardson's problems in trying to control things because the people living round about were very upset, naturally, by all the problems. There's a picture of St. Catherine's. So this is where he and his wife settled. In England, he'd married again to Drayson, Caroline Drayson, and they had lived with a minister in St. Catherine's while he went about his business as superintendent. But there were locals who were angry at him for having got the position that they thought they should have got. And he had fired a man from the force who was undermining him. And this man was hired by one of the contractors and sent by him burst into the dining room of the minister's home and arrested Richardson on some trumped-up charge, shocked his wife, and his wife, sort of, with all these pressures on Richardson, died of apoplexy. He attributed her death to all these problems, and he buried her from his brother's house in Niagara in the Butler burial ground. Eventually, in Montreal, he met the famous harpist of the day. He'd known him in his early days in London. His name was Nicholas Boxa. He's the most famous harpist of any day. And he had married Anna Bishop, the great singer, stolen her away from her composer husband, Bishop. And they traveled in Europe, and when the 1848 revolutions had set Europe aflame, they came to America. And they were in Montreal, and he said to Richardson, look, give up this. If you want to publish your novels, come to New York City. That's now blossoming as a literary center. And so he did. And there is Castle Gardens in New York City, where you could, it's right at the end of the Battery overlooking the water, and you could sit there and have a cigar and wine and enjoy yourself. And I suppose Richardson had done that. But the poor man, his books were taken up by some of the publishers, but they only paid him small lump sums. And he eventually died of starvation. Had to sell his dog to have enough to eat. There's one of his books, The Monk Knight of St. John, and that was published in New York. I reprinted it because there were only 3 copies left, and it's a very interesting story about, it starts with the Battle of Tiberias when the Crusaders were defeated by Saladin, and the protagonists come back to Auvergne in France. They developed this 3-way love relationships, which were quite unique for 1850. And the book was never reviewed, but everyone read it, so it was an underground bestseller. And this is a Écarté, which I've already told you about. It's about gambling in Paris, gambling houses. And, it's a brilliant book. It's really a biographical, really almost autobiographical in a way. And Frascati's was written with an Irishman whom he knew in Paris. It's about Paris too, but it's about two other wealthy Irishmen who go for a holiday in Paris and are swindled by a group of swindlers. One of the major people of that period is one of the major people of the swindlers is named Major Nimbleton, and I think he should have had should have been acclaimed as one of the great characters of literature. But this book apparently didn't do very well. It's not a great exciting novel. It's done in a humorous fashion, and I suppose the Irishman who wrote it with him, Justin Brennan, he had a more philosophical approach to life, and that came out in the novel. And I just want to read you a bit from my introduction to it, which I quote from the novel to give you a sense of what it's like. Their depiction of the English poets meeting at McHugh's drinking establishment in Paris must have given them great pleasure, skewering the pretensions and egos of former acquaintances. Such practices continue in the pubs and coffee houses to this day. But the author's greatest pleasure must have been in creating the nimble-witted confidence trickster, Major Nimbleton. Here is the delightful description of Nimbleton trying to sneak out of his hotel to avoid paying. The weather at this period, I must premise, was oppressively hot, so much so indeed that one could easily have dispensed with a coat had fashion or custom permitted, even in the shade. Notwithstanding this extreme sultriness, the Major had made his appearance below and was in fact issuing from the hotel for a morning promenade, as he said, with his entire wardrobe on his back. This consisted independently of linen, of 2 or 3 pairs of pantaloons, sundry waistcoats, a body coat, his braided frock, a surtout, and over all these a huge woolly dreadnought. In short, from the superfluity of apparel in which the Major had invested his person, one would have been tempted to imagine that he had dressed for the character of Sir John Falstaff, or the gravedigger in Hamlet. The side pockets of his outer coat were, moreover, filled with other movables, and projected from his hips like the paddles of a steamboat. And with all this sail hoisted, to use a nautical phrase, he was preparing to depart, when, unluckily, his enormous figure caught the vigilant eye of the porteress, who, naturally imagining so much clothing to be somewhat superfluous at such a broiling season of the year, now thought proper to lay an embargo on a vessel that to all appearance was leaving port without a license. That is that book, and there is Westbrook the Outlaw. And this novel was thought not to have existed. I was speaking to the head librarian in the National Archives in Ottawa about it when I was doing my research, and he said scholars thought it was Wacusta by another name. No one ever seen it. Well, I had found a letter in the Philadelphia Archives from Richardson in which he mentioned it, so I knew it existed, and I spent 10 years searching for it, looking through publishers' old files and trying to find the plates and so forth, but I couldn't. And then, just as I was nearing the end of the biography, I had told an old bookseller friend of mine in Manhattan about it, and he called me up and said, "Look, there's a Westbrook being sold at the book auction house 2 blocks from where you're living." So I rushed down. What it was a serialized version, an old newspaper that had lain for 120 some odd years in an Albany warehouse, and people some jobber had got rid of it and taken it to this book auction house, and that's how it came about. So I put it out, and it's about the trader Andrew Westbrook in the War of 1812, who led American marauders up the Thames River Valley to burn the mills and capture the important citizens for ransom in Kentucky. It's a very interesting Gothic novel, and someone thinks it'd make a good movie. Maybe it will be someday. And this is a picture of the Canadian campaign, which I've told you about. Richardson's experiences in the War of 1812. Now we come to another part, and this is a great Canadian actor, and who lived larger than life. His name is McKee Rankin, and there's a picture of him in his heyday. And there's a picture of the early theater in Cleveland, 1863, where he really got his start. He'd been in school. He was born in Windsor, and his father was a fairly prominent entrepreneur and member of Parliament. Sent him to Upper Canada College, where he wasn't very happy, and he escaped at the age of 16 to Rochester, where he got into a theater and acted in small parts. When his father tracked him down and brought him back, but eventually he'd signed up to fight in the Civil War, but his mother said, well, you can go into the theater then if you like. I'd rather you be on stage, a disgraceful profession, than to be a corpse. So that's how he started, and he met very early in his career these two great actors, E.L. Davenport and Wallach, and they taught him the basics. That's why he became such a great actor, I think. There's his most famous role. That's the front of the book. It's Sandy McGee in a play that he had dreamt up but didn't write. He got someone else to do it. He laid it out by scenes, and someone wrote it. And it became one of the most popular plays of the age. And he acted in many performances. And his wife, Kitty Blanchard, played in it as well. It's about the Danites were the secret police for the Mormons, and at one point they had dressed as Indians and massacred settlers who were going west. And if the story is about children of parents who had been massacred, and they escaped and were in the Sierra Mountains, hiding out, and the Avengers, these Danites, were looking for them to kill them, and so the girl dressed as a miner, it was named Billy Piper, and Sandy McGee looked after her. He was a rough fellow with a heart of gold, that sort of thing. It was, by the way, he had the first American cast in that to go to London and play there in 1880. But there was his most famous role as a matinee idol. He acted in The Two Orphans, which is the most famous play of the day in the Union Square Theater. He was a bully, nicknamed Hercules, the son of this woman who took one of the orphans and made her beg for them in the street. It was a French play which had been adapted to the American stage and proved to be one of the first great long run of any play. There is Mrs. John Drew of the Arch Street Theater. She was another great influence on Rankin, because she ran the Arch Street Theater in Philadelphia, and she ran a very tight ship, and this was regarded as the best theater in America. When he was age 21, he was chosen as the leading man in that theater, which was quite an honor. And he really developed there because all the great stars came to act. In those days in the Actors Theater, the star decided what plays were going to be acted, and the Repertory Theater had to adapt to it. And when the star arrived, they were ready to go on stage with him. There's a picture of Rankin's wife, Kitty Blanchard, in Black-Eyed Susan. The serious play was called Black-Eyed Susan, but this was hyphenated, was a burlesque, taken off on the regular play, a takeoff on the regular play, and she was dressed as William there, the hero of the play, and this was the first sort of, I wouldn't call it a pin-up actually, but it's the first picture of a girl on the card like that was popular and sent around. She was quite a popular stage personality as a young girl. But they became well known in America as the happily married family, but actually Rankin fell in love with this young girl when she was a young girl and developed her into a leading lady, as she was quite beautiful, Mabel Burt, and they had a daughter by her. He had 2 daughters by his first wife. Actually, his first wife was really his second wife because he'd been married before that. He was a sort of a bigamist in a sense, but you could get away with it in those days. This girl, though, left him eventually, and their daughter married Lionel Barrymore and went on stage with him, and she was quite a good actress. Eventually, he came across this lady, Nance O'Neill, and this is the great American tragedy of that period. He developed her from a shy little girl into a powerful actress. She was called the American Bernhardt, and she developed. He went around the world with her, in Australia and Africa, Europe, London, and so on. There's another famous role of hers in The Jewess. She had great power, but for a long time, they couldn't break through into decent theaters. After the Civil War, the war profiteers had bought up so much of the media outlets, the newspapers, the theaters, and so on, and they were out to make money, and they controlled things, so they had bad actors. They wouldn't have to pay them much, and they picked the plays themselves. And it was so if you wanted to do good stuff and be great, you had to go independently. Here she runs. Nance O'Neill did finally have her break in Boston. It was quite amazing, the enthusiasm for her there, and that set her as a star. And there she is facing off against Madame Fisk, whose husband was very prominent in the theater business. He ran the drama magazine, and she was from New York and a lot of power. Well, this is when Nance O'Neill, who owed everything to Rankin really, came to New York to play Hedda Gabler. And I just want to read you a part from my book, McKee Rankin and the Heyday of the American Theater, which is a description of her by a critic in Boston playing this role. And you get some idea of her appeal. The writer was the editor of the Literary World. O'Neill was easily the finest English-speaking actress I've ever seen, and I've seen all the good ones who have appeared in this country. Physically, she is splendid, a superb figure, a handsome face, a wonderful voice, and every movement is grace itself. She is the most graceful woman I've ever seen. Bernhardt has surely grace, but she had no backbone to hold it up. She is too lithe, too willowy, as the word goes. She bends and sways too much. This woman can stand up and can be rigid and dignified, while at the same time she has every pliant and supple movement. Therefore, I hold that she is superior in this respect to Bernhardt. Her chief characteristic, self-restraint, a reserve so extraordinary that I've never seen the like, and great naturalness. You feel all the time that she is the character she's playing, that she is not acting, that she is restrained by conventional decencies, as we all are in real life. She seems to be trying all the time as Hedda not to give way to her passions, and you feel in seeing her that this is so, and you dread lest she should give way as you do in real life when you are in the midst of some emotional crisis with an emotional person. Eventually, because of certain pressures, she split with Rankin, and she split with Rankin and had to go on her own, and really didn't do so well that way, but carried on well on at the end of the 1900s. I think she died at the age of 90 around 1960, And Rankin himself died in 1914, acting practically every day of his life. It's amazing how he was able to do that. I have to catch up here. How did it go back like that? Come on. Can you stop it?